Hello, everyone. This is the 106th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles from the Soccer Nostalgia blog, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England and the 1888 letter blog. For this episode, we welcome back Brazilian journalist Mr. José Inácio Werneck as we discuss the Brazil national team during the 1970 World Cup. Mr. Werneck is a journalist, lawyer, interpreter, translator, writer, and a triathlete. I would like to mention that we are recording this podcast on the morning after the death of Mario Zagallo at the age of 92, the manager of Brazil in this 1970 World Cup that we'll discuss. Hello, José Inácio. Welcome back.
Hello, how are you? Good morning, both of you.
Following the disaster of 1966, what were the state of the affairs and changes in Brazilian football since in terms of football culture and sociologically?
Well, 1966 was, as you said, a disaster for Brazil, and the things didn't improve much after that. So that led João Avelange, who was the president of the Brazilian Football Federation, to invite João Saldanha to be the new coach or the new manager for Brazil in 1970. And what led João Avelange to this was the fact that João Saldanha was a very prominent critic of the way that Brazil was doing at the time. And so he thought the best thing that I can do now is have someone like him, who is an outside critic, come inside and be the new coach. And João Saldanha had been a coach before, but he never had a very long career as a coach. He had coached the club team Botafogo in 1957, and he had won the Rio de Janeiro championship. But he resigned soon after, and he became instead a football analyst. So the choice was very much criticized at the time by at least two other managers, Zezé Moreira, who had managed Brazil in 1954, and Hugh Strick, who was a very well-known manager in Brazil at the time. He had never managed Brazil as a national team, but he had a degree in coaching, something that João Saldanha didn't have. And he said that was absurd to have someone with no degree in coaching to become a manager of the national team, someone who really was an outsider. And Zezé Moreira also criticized João Saldanha, calling him an intruder. And this was the background that led Brazil to the 1970 World Cup, and many other things would happen. It would be a very controversial period.
So if we start off with Pelé, in our previous podcast, we charted his level of fame from tournament to tournament. Where was he at this point in his career, 1969, going into 1970, now at the age of 29?
Yeah, Pelé was also not at a very high point in his career at the time. Many people said that Pelé was past his prime, and he wanted to prove that was not true at all, and he was very keen in performing in that 1970 World Cup. And what happened is that when João Saldanha became the coach, one of the problems with Brazil at the time is that the team was always changing. Different managers would come and they would never really settle on a team, repeating the pattern of what had happened in 1966, when Brazil called 44 players and never really came to define who were the first choice players, who were the second choice players. So João Saldanha came on and said, the day he was made coach, he announced 11 first choice players and 11 second choice players. So there were 22 players, and everybody knew who was going to be first choice, who was going to be second choice. And Pelé, of course, was João Saldanha's first choice. João Saldanha had three players that, when you think about that 1970 time, really were the backbone of the team. Carlos Alberto in defense, Gerson in midfield, and Pelé as a forward. the players who would never leave the team. The team would change sometimes. Even Jairzinho, who was the top scorer in the World Cup in 1970, was not really totally sure, 100% sure that he was going to be a first-choice team in 1970. I mean, João Saldanha had announced 11 first-choice players and 11 second-choice, but that would change with time, and of course, players get injured and all that. So even Jairzinho, at some point, was kind of under the threat of losing his place as an outside winger to Rogério. Rogério played 1 or 2 games in Brazil, was already in Mexico, and Rogério played 1 or 2 games because Zagallo, who became the new coach, wanted to test Rogério as a possible outside right and have Jairzinho playing a center forward, because you remember that Tostão at the time had the problem with his detached retina. So Tostão was also in doubt. But Carlos Alberto, Gerson, and Pelé were always there. And Pelé, of course, would play all the games in 1970. Carlos Alberto would play all the games in 1970. Tostão would come back to the team after the surgery of his detached retina. And Jairzinho would be the top scorer. But what happened during the World Cup itself is that one of these mainstays of the team, that was Gerson, in the game versus Czechoslovakia, in the second half, he pulled a muscle. So he didn't play the next game. He pulled the muscle and he didn't play against England. But eventually he came back to the team and Brazil won with him. But Pelé played all the games and Jairzinho played all the games in the World Cup. And Carlos Alberto played all the games in the 1970 World Cup.
Pelé, we have to remember that in November 1969, he scored his 1,000th goal. So that was very much in the news. Getting back to Saldanha and the World Cup qualifiers in 1969, you mentioned that he had a basic unit of 11 players. Apparently, this did not sit well with some of the authorities because they felt that the players would be complacent. As far as the qualifiers itself, Brazil just breezed through them. They were all played in August 1969 against Colombia, Venezuela, and Paraguay. Brazil won every one of those matches. And most specifically, Tostão scored many goals in these qualifiers. Can you kind of describe more the background of Saldanha and his philosophy in general?
Yeah, Saldanha was a very controversial character. I would like to come into this 1970 World Cup. The other day, I was writing in my Twitter account about João Saldanha having an argument with Alf Ramsey, who was then coach of England, because Alf Ramsey was accusing the Brazilians of being rough, and João Saldanha was saying, no, it is the English who play very rough. They were totally opposite personalities. Alf Ramsey was the typical insular Englishman who thought that the world was divided between, the English people who were very, up there, and the rest of the world was down there, especially countries in Latin America. Like Argentina, he famously called the Argentinians animals, and the Mexicans, he went to Mexico one year before the World Cup to make friends and get to know the place, all that in preparation for the World Cup. That was in 1969, in a tour in preparation for the World Cup in 1970, and he only managed to make enemies in Mexico. So that when the World Cup started in 1970, all the Mexicans hated the England team, and all the Mexicans were rooting for Brazil. And Saldanha was the opposite personality to Alf Ramsey. He was a guy who had lived in exile because of his political convictions. He belonged to the Communist Party in Brazil, so he had to live abroad. He was a very cosmopolitan person, totally the opposite of Alf Ramsey. But Alf Ramsey was very cool and controlled, and João Saldanha was very exuberant and not controlled at all, and always getting involved in controversies. And that's what led him to be finally sacked by João Avelange, the guy who had picked him to be the coach, finally sacked him after some controversial results. And Saldanha also had got involved in an argument with Pelé, had accused Pelé of being blind, and all that led to Zagallo finally coming to be the manager in February, March 1970.
Just before that, can you describe the preparations while Saldanha was still in charge?
Yeah, the preparation under Saldanha, the whole campaign that Brazil led to qualify for the World Cup in 1970 was smooth. Brazil won all the games easily. The most difficult game, actually, was the last one against Paraguay at Maracanã, when Brazil scored a winning goal by Pelé. And that was the only difficult match, but Brazil won all the matches. So the preparations were good. But what happened is that soon after, the troubles started. First, Tostão had a detached retina. In a game, he was hit by a ball, and that led to his retina becoming detached. And so there was much speculation that he would not be able to play in the 1970 World Cup. And at that time, Brazil was playing in a 4-2-4 tactical formation, with Pelé and Tostão playing together, Edu playing as an outside left, and a very offensive-minded formation. But when Tostão became injured, and there was this doubt whether he would be able to play in the World Cup and all that. At that same time, Pelé had started to disagree with Saldanha about the tactical formation. Pelé was more in favor of a 4-3-3 system, and Saldanha said, "No, we have to play in 4-2-4." So that was what was going on at the time. Then Brazil lost a friendly in Minas Gerais, in the state of Minas Gerais, to the Minas Gerais 11, a select team from Minas Gerais. That was really more kind of a training match, a friendly, than a real official game. But that led Strick, who was the coach of Minas Gerais, and who had been a fierce critic of Saldanha, to redouble his criticisms of Saldanha. That led in the end to João Saldanha going after Strick armed with a gun. Saldanha was this kind of person. So then led to another training game against a side called Bangu, a club team in Rio de Janeiro. And it was only a draw. The team didn't play well. All that led to the fact that Saldanha was eventually sacked and Zagallo came on as a replacement. That happened in March 1970. So that was the background to the Brazil campaign in the World Cup in Mexico.
Getting back to the preparation in February, still under Saldanha, they stayed at a Jesuit monastery near Copacabana Beach, and where the players were tested, and around in March, their wives were allowed to join them. Final preparation phase was at a town called Guanajuato, which was 60 miles from Guadalajara. Now, Saldanha had to cut the likes of Jalma Diaz and Rildo because of injuries around this time. So, and later on, Toninho and Scala were also injured and replaced by Zé Carlos and Fontana. So after Brazil were placed in Guadalajara, Saldanha scrapped the altitude training and matches in Colombia and Ecuador and postponed Brazil's departure by a month. And as a result, Brazil were unable to arrange any friendlies against quality European opposition. And therefore, all the friendlies were against South American clubs and nations.
Saldanha was the coach until March 1970. There was a game against Argentina in Porto Alegre. Brazil lost 2-0.
Yes.
And after that, Pelé started criticizing Saldanha for playing in the 4-2-4 tactical formation. He wanted a 4-3-3. Then that was on a Wednesday. Then on Sunday, that same week, Brazil beat Argentina at Maracanã, 2-1. Pelé scored the winning goal for Brazil. But there was already this bad atmosphere between Saldanha and Pelé. That was at the time that Saldanha started to spread the rumor that Pelé was blind. Then came the friendly versus Bangu, a club team. It was a draw. After that, And all this compounded by the arguments and between Saldanha and Ustrik, and Saldanha and José Moreira, and the fact that Saldanha went with a gun after Ustrik. Saldanha was sacked. So from March on, it was Zagallo, the new coach. So all these friendlies in Guanajuato, León, and other places in Mexico before the World Cup were already under Zagallo. Saldanha was not in the picture anymore. And the Zagallo at the time was very much in doubt whether he could play Tostão or not. First of all, he had to make sure that Tostão was physically fit. Tostão could see well after the surgery on his detached retina. And even after that, Zagallo was not very sure about Tostão. That's why at some point he thought of playing Jairzinho as a center forward and Rogério as an outside right. But Rogério was injured, had the muscle pull, eventually was cut from the team. Jairzinho became the man playing on the outside right, and Tostão finally got the blessing from Zagallo to be the center forward together with Pelé. But for a long time, Zagallo was very much in doubt whether Tostão and Pelé could play together. Something that, on the contrary, Saldanha was also in favor of having Pelé and Tostão playing together.
So when this appointment was made, when Zagallo was brought in, what were the main differences basically between Zagallo and Saldanha? And was the decision in general welcomed by the press and Brazilian public?
Well, the main difference between Saldanha and Zagallo was always tactical. Zagallo had played, in the World Cup in 1958, in 1962, in a 4-3-3 tactical formation. He was an outside left who would help the midfield. And Saldanha was in favor of a 4-2-4 formation with Edu playing as an outside left, but going forward. So tactically, they were totally different. Zagallo was very cautious, and Saldanha was more an attacking kind of manager. That was the main difference. Zagallo had started coaching after he played in 1958, he played in 1962. Then in 1966, he started coaching Botafogo. Eventually, he was made the Brazil manager after Saldanha was sacked. That was in March 1970. They were two people with totally different mental outlook. Saldanha was very outgoing. Zagallo had always been a very reserved man. And this temperament of Zagallo was reflected in the way the team played under him. They were polar opposites in everything. And to explain more, Paul, at the time when Saldanha was sacked by João Avelange, there were many people in Brazil who didn't want that to happen. They still favored Saldanha because they thought Zagallo was too cautious. But the fact is that Zagallo won that World Cup as a manager.
We've mentioned already Tostão's eye injury. Can you just describe that a little bit more and how serious that was for his potential to miss the World Cup completely and indeed his career as a whole?
It was very serious. Up until when Brazil embarked to Mexico in April, there was a lot of doubt whether Tostão could still be able to play the World Cup because he had the accident at the end of 1969. Then he went to the United States. He had surgery in his eye, came back to Brazil. I remember in February of that year, even a little bit before, in January of that year, 1970, during the vacations for the players, or the holidays, as the English say, he was doing physical training, trying to see whether he could be able to return to the Brazilian team and present himself to the Brazilian team in February next year, when Brazil would start doing their preparations for the 1970 World Cup. So there was still a lot of doubt. When Zagallo came, this doubt about his physical fitness was compounded by the fact that Zagallo was also doubting whether he could be a partner to Pelé, speaking in tactical terms, nothing to do with the injury. Even in tactical terms, Zagallo thought that maybe Tostão and Pelé couldn't play together because basically they were strikers who played the same position. Pelé played for Santos and Tostão played for Cruzeiro, and Tostão's role in Cruzeiro was the same as Pelé's role was in Santos. So Zagallo thought that maybe he should have Pelé and have a center forward with more of a characteristic of a center forward. That's why he thought about Dario. That's why he even thought about having Jairzinho playing as a center forward and Rogério playing outside right. And that's why he also, in the end, took that player, Roberto Miranda, from Botafogo as a center forward. You must remember that in the game against England, Roberto Miranda, in the second half, came on the pitch replacing Tostão. So Zagallo was not totally convinced that Tostão and Pelé could play together, but in the end they did, and Brazil won the World Cup.
Let's look at the final 22 as selected by Mario Zagallo for the 1970 World Cup. Number 1, starting goalkeeper, we have Felix of Fluminense. Number 2, defender, we have Brito of Flamengo. Number 3, another defender, we have Wilson Piazza of Cruzeiro. Number 4, captain of the team, Carlos Alberto of Santos. Number 5, midfielder, Clodoaldo of Santos. Number 6, defender, Marco Antonio of Fluminense. Number 7, forward, Jairzinho of Botafogo. Number 8 in midfield, Gerson of Sao Paulo. Number 9, striker, Tostão of Cruzeiro. Number 10, Pelé of Santos. Number 11, another striker, Roberto Rivellino of Corinthians. Number 12, backup goalkeeper, Ado of Corinthians. Number 13, midfielder, Roberto Miranda of Botafogo. Number 14, defender, Baldocky of Palmeiras. Number 15, defender, Fontana of Cruzeiro. Number 16, defender, Everaldo of Grêmio. Number 17, defender, Joel of Santos. Number 18, midfielder, Paulo Cesar of Botafogo. Number 19, striker, Edu of Santos. Number 20, striker, Dario of Atlético Mineiro. Number 21, defender, Zé Maria of Portuguesa. And number 22, goalkeeper, backup goalkeeper, Emerson Leão of Palmeiras. Now, from this group, Pelé had been present in 1958, 1962, and 1966. And the holdovers from the 1966 included Brito, Jairzinho, Gerson, Tostão, and Edu. And in the end, Zagallo cut Rogério of Botafogo, Dirceu Lopes of Cruzeiro, and Zé Carlos of Cruzeiro. As far as the breakdown of the team, we have 11 players from Sao Paulo, 6 players from Rio, 4 players from Minas Gerais, and 1 player from Rio Grande do Sul.
This seemed like one of the occasions where the team seemed solid. You mentioned Rogério. Were there notable absences from this squad?
Well, Rogério was a notable absence because, as I said, at some point, there is a very strange story. Zagallo wanted so much to have Rogério that he took Rogério to Mexico, even though the team doctor at the time, Lídio Toledo, had already said that Rogério would not be fit. But Zagallo so much wanted Rogério playing as an outside right and Jairzinho playing a center forward that he took Rogério to Mexico. And the doctor, who was in Mexico doing inspections of the different places where Brazil would be playing, was surprised to see Rogério disembark with the team. And soon after, what happened is that, in fact, Rogério was cut from the team because he was not in a physical condition, and that made sure then that Jairzinho could be the outside right player and become the top scorer. And Shea was talking about all these different players, but when you think of it, the basic formation was always that: Félix, Carlos Alberto, Brito, Piazza, Everaldo, Clodoaldo, Gerson, Jairzinho, Pelé, Tostão, and Rivellino. That became the basic formation. And there is a very interesting story about Félix, because as I said before, when Saldanha became the team manager in 1969, he announced, 11 first-choice players and 11 second-choice players, and Felix, the goalkeeper, was his goalkeeper, and Felix was the goalkeeper throughout the qualifying games for the World Cup. But after that, Saldanha decided, I don't really think that Felix is all that good. And then he started experimenting with Ado Leão. Zagallo also experimented with Ado Leão. But in the end, Felix, the first guy who had been called by João Saldanha and had been eventually dropped by João Saldanha, came back and he played all the games in the World Cup. All the games that Brazil played in the World Cup had Felix as a goalkeeper, even though he was very much, he was even short for a goalkeeper. Felix was maybe 5'9", not more than 5'9", 1.75 meters. That is short for a goalkeeper. But he overcame all that, all the criticisms that the people. I remember English journalists say, this guy, he cannot be the goalkeeper for Brazil. In the end, he played all the games of the World Cup, like Jairzinho played all the games, like Pelé played all the games, and Gerson didn't play all the games. And I'll tell you that game, Brazil and England, that Brazil won nothing, would have been easier for Brazil if Gerson had played that game. He was a very important piece of Brazil in 1970.
Following the failure of the 1966 World Cup, was the Brazilian press expectations more grounded, or was there a feeling that Brazil should win again?
When Saldanha became the coach, there was a kind of injection of optimism in Brazil because of his personality, the way he was, and Brazil started to win all the games in the qualifying for the World Cup in 1970. There was a lot of optimism. That stopped when he was sacked and Zagallo came, and there was a lot of controversy. Can this team really win it or not? And in the end, Brazil won. So there was a difference. In the beginning of the campaign, in 1969, for the qualifying games, there was a lot of optimism. That optimism stopped or ceased to be after Saldanha was brought in. But in the end, even though Zagallo was criticized by a lot of people, he won the World Cup. And after Brazil started playing, after the first game against Czechoslovakia that Brazil won 4-1, I can say the optimism came back, returned, but not before the very beginning of the World Cup.
Ahead of this World Cup, José Inácio, where were you personally in life? How did you observe this World Cup? Was it as a spectator or professionally?
No, I was working for Jornal do Brasil. I had worked for Jornal do Brasil covering the World Cup in 1966, and I did again in 1970. I did again in 1974. I did again in 1978. Actually, I know you have heard about this book here. This book that you can translate as Return to the Sea was about the World Cup in 1978. So I was very much involved as a journalist at the time, working for a newspaper called Jornal do Brasil. And that's why I was there in Mexico covering the World Cup in 1970. So I followed all these, the preparation, the World Cup itself, very closely.
So let's start with the World Cup. Brazil started its World Cup. They were in Group 3 with England, defending champions, Czechoslovakia, and Romania at Guadalajara. So Brazil's first match was on June 3rd at Guadalajara against Czechoslovakia. Brazil's lineup for this match, we have Felix, Carlos Alberto, captain of the team, Brito, Piazza, he'd be replaced by Fontana in the 88th minute, Everaldo, Clodoaldo, Gerson, he'd be replaced by Paulo Cesar in the 74th minute, Jairzinho, Tostão, Pele, and Rivelino. Czechoslovakia took the lead in the 11th minute through Ladislav Petras, but Brazil then stormed back. In the 24th minute, Rivelino scored with a free kick. In the 59th minute, we have the famous Pele goal where Gerson sent a long cross, Pele chested it and then volleyed.
Yep.
And Jairzinho scored twice in the 61st minute and in the 81st minute. By scoring, actually, Pele became, along with Uwe Seeler, the first player to score in 4 straight World Cups. A few days later, on June 7th, we have the famous match against defending champions England. And like you mentioned, because of mostly Alf Ramsey's outbursts, England had the crowd against them. For this match, Brazil started with Felix, Carlos Alberto, Brito, Piazza, Everaldo, Clodoaldo, Paulo Cesar, who I believe started ahead of Gerson, Jairzinho, Tostão. He'd be replaced by Roberto Miranda in the 68th minute, Pele, and Rivellino. And of course, this is one of the classic matches of World Cup history. It was finally settled with a famous goal by Jairzinho. We have Tostão on the left wing. He crosses it across to Pele right in the middle, who passes to Jairzinho, who scores the winner. This was perhaps Brazil's most difficult match in this World Cup.
It was made more difficult by the fact that Gerson was not playing. Gerson was a very important piece of the Brazil team at that time. As you said before, the game before against Romania, that's when he got injured. Since the beginning of the World Cup, he was having some, muscle problems. And so, in the game versus England, he could not play. That made a difference. It would have been easier for Brazil. But after that, he recovered and played very well against Peru, Uruguay, and Italy in the final.
Paul, let me ask you, from an English perspective, this is one of the matches that is, like I said, to this day, continuously referenced. The Gordon Banks save from Pele's header, the immortal image of Pele and Bobby Moore after exchanging kits, the fact that it was regarded as a final of sorts, and like I mentioned, perhaps Brazil's most difficult match. Will the legacy of this match stay with the English into the future?
I think so. All the images you mentioned are well remembered. You could also add the great chance that Jeff Astle missed at the end of this match. I think it was memorable at the time for being seen, for one thing, on colour television, which was the first time a UK audience had seen that. I think that made it more vivid. And also in retrospect, because this was the last tournament that England were at for a long time. So these images really are the most vivid ones for the whole of the 1970s. And for a defeat, it was an honourable defeat, I think, given the conditions, given the quality of the opposition. I think England were generally happy to have more or less matched a great Brazil team. But unfortunately, it then meant meeting West Germany in the quarterfinals. And what are your memories of this match, José Inácio?
Yeah, I was also present at this match, England versus West Germany, because I was covering Brazil all the time. But because I knew very well the England team at that time, I was sent to Guanajuato, León, where England was playing West Germany. So that was the only Brazil game I didn't see. Brazil was playing Peru, but that same day I was in León with England playing West Germany. And England was winning the game. Alf Ramsey had the bad idea of pulling out Bobby Charlton. And famously, everybody knows the story, West Germany came back. A regular time ended 2-2. And then West Germany scored in extra time. Miller, if I'm not mistaken, either Gerd Miller or Uwe Seeler. I think it was Miller who scored, and England was out of the World Cup. But as I said before, when Ramsey complained about the crowds being against England, the crowds were against England because of him, because he had managed to make everybody the enemies of England by his personality. He was a cold person, but very offensive, very aggressive in a very cold way. The year before the World Cup, he had been in Mexico, and ostensibly to make friends, but he only made enemies. He criticized everything: the water, the food, the people, the crime. There was a famous story that he was taken to Guadalajara to be shown the stadium by the governor of the state of Jalisco. The governor was escorting him into the dressing rooms to show the dressing rooms, and the Mexican press followed him. And he turned around and sent them away, expelled. They have no right to be here, out of here. He was not even the owner of the stadium. The guy who could say that to the press or not, whether they could stay or not, was the governor of Jalisco, not of Ramsey. So he managed to make everybody hate England. That is the story. I was there in 1970. The Mexican crowds really hated England, but it was all the work of Alf Ramsey, the England manager. And I remember also, Paul, that famous Jeff Hassel miss. It was a gift, a present given him by Everaldo, the left fullback. He made a dreadful mistake. The ball came to him, and he played on the left side of the field. He played the ball straight back into the central area of the field in front of his box. And the ball fell to Jeff Hassel. He should have scored, but he didn't.
José Inácio, let me ask you this. There's been a lot of controversy about complaints from mostly European sides to play the matches during the midday heat just to appease to the, I guess, European television. Did you ever feel that vibe from players or managers that you interviewed during those days?
Yeah, no, that was, as you said, that was a demand from European television because of the time difference, right? So They wanted to show the games at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in England and the rest of Europe. And so they had to play the games at 12 o'clock, midday, under a blazing sun in the summer in Mexico. So the conditions were really very unfavorable to the Europeans, especially to England. They suffered a lot. Yeah, that was very much criticized at the time. And that, of course, didn't help teams like England and West Germany, even though West Germany reached the semifinals. But the last game, Brazil and Italy, the weather was kind of cool. It was in Mexico City, even though it was at midday, it was not as hot as it had been, say, in Guadalajara.
Getting back to the World Cup, the final match in Brazil's group on June 10th, again at Guadalajara, they faced Romania. So for this match, Brazil starts with Felix, Carlos Alberto, Brito, Fontana, Everaldo. He'd be replaced by Marco Antonio in the 57th minute. Piazza, Clodoaldo. He'd be replaced by Edu in the 74th minute. Jairzinho, Tostão, Pele, and Paulo Cesar. So Brazil would win this match 3-2. Pele scored in the 19th minute from a free kick. Jairzinho scored in the 22nd minute. Afterwards, in the 34th minute, Dumitrac pulled the goal back for Romania. But Pele scored Brazil's third goal in the 67th minute. And before the end, in the 84th minute, Dembrovski pulled another goal for Romania. And Brazil won 3-2 and won all their matches in this group. And we're through to the quarterfinals. For the quarterfinals, Brazil were staying in, as group winners, they stayed in Guadalajara. So on June 14th, they faced a surprising South American side, Peru. For this match, Brazil started with Felix, Carlos Alberto, Brito, Piazza, Marco Antonio, Clodoaldo, Gerson. He'd be replaced by Paulo Cesar in the 67th minute. Jairzinho. He'd be replaced by Roberto Miranda in the 80th minute. Tostão, Pele, and Rivellino. So Brazil would win this match 4-2. Rivellino scored in the 11th minute. Tostão doubled the lead in the 15th minute, scoring from a narrow angle. Peru pulled the goal back through Alberto Gallardo in the 28th minute. But Brazil scored again through Tostão in the 52nd minute. Again, Peru would pull a goal back through Teofilo Cubillas in the 70th minute. And Brazil would score the fourth goal through Jairzinho in the 75th minute. A lot of goals, and I guess maybe the score is closer than the difference in the teams indicate. And Brazil were comfortable winners, I imagine. Brazil were through to the semifinals again at Guadalajara. They were to face another South American side, Uruguay, who had eliminated the Soviet Union in the quarterfinals. So for this match, Brazil started with Felix, Carlos Alberto, Brito, Piazza, Everaldo, Clodoaldo, Gerson, Jairzinho, Tostao, Pele, and Rivellino.
Yeah, that was, let's say that was the ideal Brazil team. That was really the first choice players altogether. José was back in the team, Pelé, Tostão, Carlos Alberto, that was really the first choice players Brazil had at the time.
Uruguay took the lead in this match through Luis Cubia in the 19th minute. But Brazil tied the match just before halftime when Clodoaldo scored after Tostao's cross from the left side. Brazil would have to wait until the 76th minute when Jairzinho scored the go-ahead goal. And just before the end, Rivellino, a pass from Pele, scored right from the edge of the box, the third goal, and Brazil were through to the final. And this match is famous for the goal that Pele could have scored that would have been a memorable goal when he feigned to confuse the Uruguayan goalkeeper and go around him, but his shot went wide.
Yeah, Pelé could have scored two memorable. Was it that game? Yeah, it was in that game. Two memorable goals against Uruguay. First, when Mazurkiewicz took a short free kick because he used to take the free kicks, try to pass the ball to one of his playmates in midfield. And the ball came towards midfield and Pelé hit it first time. And Mazurkiewicz made a save. That could have been a very brilliant goal. And then there was the famous play in which José Pelé, went one way and let the ball go the other way. And totally blindsided, Mazurkiewicz could have scored also. Yeah, he fainted and without touching the ball. And of course, there was also that famous attempt in the game versus Czechoslovakia, in which he tried to score from
right, yes, from middle of
behind
field.
the halfway line. Yeah,
right. Brazil were through to the final, facing Italy, who had defeated West Germany in the what's referred to as the match of the century, the 4-3 match after extra time. So on June 21st at the Azteca at Mexico City, Brazil faced Italy. For this match, we have Felix, Carlos Alberto, captain of the team, Brito, Piazza, Everaldo, Clodoaldo, Gerson, Jairzinho, Tostao, Pele, and Rivellino. Brazil takes the lead in the 18th minute. Rivellino crossed from the left side, and Pele jumped high and headed past Albertozzi. But before the halftime, in the 37th minute, Clodoaldo attempted a backheel pass and it failed, and Boninsegna picked it up and shot into an empty net. The match was 1-1 at halftime. But in the second half, probably all the fatigue from the match against West Germany finally caught up with the Italians. In the 66th minute, Gerson scored a go-ahead goal with a brilliant long-range shot from outside of the box. And after that, the rout was on. So in the 71st minute, Jairzinho scored a third goal. And by doing so, he scored in every match during this World Cup. And finally, in the 86th minute, we all remember the much referenced, the much replaced, brilliant Carlos Alberto goal when over on the left side, Jairzinho passes across to Pele, who immediately passes to the right for the onrushing Carlos Alberto to blast home the fourth goal. And Brazil won. They won their third World Cup, the sole owners of the Jules Rimet Trophy. Mario Zagallo became the first person to win the World Cup as a player and a manager.
That match was easy for Brazil. Italy only scored because of a silly play by Clodoaldo in the first half. And tactically, it was easy because of the Italian system of playing man-to-man. And that really what made the difference, because Jairzinho would go to the center and Carlos Alberto would go forward in his place. And it is amazing how Valcareggi was the Italian coach at the time, manager, if I remember well. Amazing, he didn't see that happen the whole game. It happened time and time again. And in the end, you had the goal that Carlos Alberto scored that was just because of that. There was nobody there. The play started with Clodoaldo. Clodoaldo passed the ball around, and eventually the ball went to Tostão. Tostão gave the ball to Pelé, and Carlos Alberto was coming on the right, totally unmarked. What was the name of the Italian left back, very well known?
Facchetti.
Jacinto Facchetti, was not there. And so it was a game that tactically was very easy for Brazil. It is true that Italy was tired from playing West Germany, having to play extra time, but that doesn't really explain it. It was, of all the matches Brazil played in that World Cup, the easiest, and it was the final.
What are your personal memories of the game, José Inácio? Can you describe the atmosphere in the stadium for us?
Yeah, the atmosphere, the game was played at 12 o'clock. And as I said, the atmosphere was very much in favor of Brazil all the time. Brazil was the favorite of the Mexican supporters, not only in the game against England. All throughout the tournament, it was like Brazil was playing at home. And that was even more so obvious in the final against Italy. And after the game, there was the crowd invading the pitch, and celebrating. It was a World Cup that was memorable for Brazil in many, many ways, and also because of the very nice atmosphere that was provided for Brazil by the Mexican supporters.
Was this title, in a way, looked upon as Brazil and Pele settling the score and exercising 1966 and a return to the natural order of things with Brazil at the top?
It was no doubt exercising what had happened in 1966. It was in many ways the pinnacle of Brazil's dominance of world football, because after that, what you have, and you can see that now, is that other countries started to develop more, say, sophisticated approaches to tactics, to preparation, including physical preparation, fitness, psychology, and all that. And even though Brazil still won the World Cup in '94 in the United States, but not in as brilliant a campaign as in 1970, and Brazil reached the final in 1998, and Brazil eventually won another World Cup in 2002. But you can see that from that time on, what happened is that other countries started to get closer to Brazil, and you can even say at this point have gone past Brazil in the dominance of world soccer, world football. You can see the last two World Cups in 2018, not to mention the disaster of 2014, of course, but in 2018 and 2022, Brazil going out in the quarterfinals in a not very, very brilliant way. So there is no doubt that 1970 in Mexico was the pinnacle of Brazil in world football.
And in hindsight, this 1970 triumph, what lessons do you think had been learned from 1966 in England? What had changed?
Well, the main lesson was that was taught by João Saldanha. You have to have a team. because in 1966, Brazil didn't have a team. Brazil, as I said, took 44 players to an European tour before the World Cup. They couldn't decide which were the 22 players were going to be selected. Even after they selected the 22 players, Brazil didn't have a proper first choice team because Brazil kept changing players, famously changed all the players from the Hungary match to the Portugal match. And also they came and said, let's stop this nonsense. Let's have 11 first choice players, 11 second choice players, and that is it. So that was the main lesson that Brazil took from 1966 was to stop fumbling around, try to please politicians, taking Brazil to different places in the country to play friendlies and to prepare for the World Cup. All that was put behind. And Brazil went on a very defined and clear preparation that even after João Saldanha left was continued under Zagallo. You have to give Zagallo the honor that he's due. I don't think Brazil would have won that World Cup under João Saldanha because of his ideas tactically were not as sound as Zagallo's ideas. Zagallo was, let's admit it, a better manager, a better coach than João Saldanha was or could have been. So João Saldanha was important up to a certain point. After that, by a stroke of luck, the job went to Zagallo, and Zagallo led Brazil to the World Cup in 1970. That was, but the main difference and the main lesson to be taken after 1966 was that Brazil needed to have a settled team and forget what had happened before, in which for political reasons, trying to please the governor of São Paulo or the governor of Minas Gerais or even the president of the Republic, who famously said that Dario had to be the center forward in 1970. The lesson was, let's find the best players, let's take the best players and let's play with them and let's forget about politics in Brazilian football. Unfortunately, now the situation is going back. Is reversing, because now you have a situation in Brazil where the Brazil Federation doesn't even have a president. The president of the Brazil Federation was fired or taken out of the job. Then now, thanks to a judicial measure, a decision by a minister of the Supreme Court in Brazil, was reinstated in his job, but Brazil doesn't really know whether he will stay in the job. Brazil doesn't really have a coach right now. Brazil tried to have Ancelotti. Ancelotti said no. Brazil had a new coach in Fernando Diniz, who has been sacked. Now Brazil is inviting Dorival Júnior, the Flamengo coach, to be the new coach. So Brazil has gone back. In the last few years, the truth is that Brazil football has gone back a lot in a matter of 20 years or even a little bit less.
I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast that Mario Zagallo passed away just yesterday. Do you have any personal memories from him that you might share?
Yeah, I knew Zagallo. Zagallo was a very kind of pleasant person, not very outspoken, very reserved, very private person. Obviously, a very good player, and a player who was, many people say, he was blessed by good luck. Just to mention that both in 1958 and in 1962, Zagallo was never supposed to have been the first choice for Brazil. The first choice for Brazil was Pepe, who used to play for Santos, but both in 1958 and 1962, just before the World Cup, all of a sudden, contrary to all expectations, Zagallo was made the first choice player, and he played all the games in 1958, all the games in 1962, won twice the World Cup as a player, then won again as a manager, and then won again as an assistant manager. He was not always very liked by the press in Brazil. There was a famous occasion when he was again made coach in 1998, and he said that they would have to put up with him, even though they didn't like him. But you cannot deny his contributions to world football and to Brazil football in particular, but also to world football. He was the person who have won both as a player and manager and assistant manager, more titles in the World Cup than anybody else. And I remember a story when I was working for ESPN in the United States one day in the 90s. This guy, a TV announcer, play-by-play announcer for soccer or football at ESPN, came up to me and said, "Oh, Beckenbauer, the most famous name, the most winningest person in world football." I said, "Hey, have you ever heard about somebody called Zagallo?" And he said, "Who?" I said, "Yeah, Zagallo. Zagallo won the World Cup in 1958 as a player, 1960 as a player, 1970 as a manager, 1994 as assistant manager, and almost won again in 1998. You are being too Eurocentric. You have to think more about other people than European coaches and managers." So Zagallo is a legend in world football, and he has to be respected because of that.
In closing, we discussed on our very first podcast with you regarding the 1958 World Cup, whether that was the best ever Brazilian World Cup team or this 1970 Brazilian side. And I think most of the general opinion seems to be on this 1970 side because of perhaps color television plays a part in that. What are your thoughts now?
It's very difficult to say. I would say both sides were brilliant. No doubt that 1958, the side in 1958 was better than in 1962. But I would say that both 1958, when you had a team with players like Gilmar, like Djalma Santos, who actually came only to play in the final, but you had Pelé, and you had Garrincha. In midfield, you had Zito. You had brilliant players at the time. And in 1970, I think these two teams, 1958 and 1970, I followed both of them very closely. I would not say which one was better than the other. Both were very good. Both were the best in Brazil history. No doubt about that.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, for any questions and comments, you may contact us. You may contact me on my blog and on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Riddle can be contacted on Twitter at 1888 letter, and his blog is the 1888 letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. Mr. Werneck's contact info is also listed and on the blog and podcast listings. So thank you very much, José Inácio. Looking forward to the next discussion. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your memories with us.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.